everyone, and welcome to Feeding His Sheep as we begin our study in the book of Daniel. Now, Daniel is a very unusual book. It fits into so many categories. Where do you begin? It's classified with the prophets. It contains prophecies, and some have been fulfilled in incredible detail, some of which will be fulfilled in the future. It also contains a rich history of several nations, and yet some of the characters are examples as how we should live and interact in a country that does not follow our God. So it's just as relevant today as it was back when it was written. But one thing that I find fascinating is that where most prophets are foretelling of judgment and exile, and others are about picking up the pieces after the exile, the book of Daniel covers the span of several kings for the entire time that the nation of Israel was in exile. Now, Daniel was likely a teenager when he was initially led captive, and he was an old man by the end of this book, covering the full 70 years of the nation's judgment. The parts of Daniel that are historical will pass quickly when we're studying them, but we'll always look for a personal application within the text. But on some of the prophecies and the visions that tend to confuse a lot of people, we're going to spend more time untangling those and seeing exactly what they mean when we get to those. So in Daniel chapter 1, let's go ahead and begin with the first two verses. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the vessels of the house of God, and he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and he brought the vessels into the treasury of his God. It's always nice when the writer gives us a date or a timestamp along with the book. It helps us to not only understand the text more, but see who all overlaps in his ministry. Over a century before Babylon overthrew Judah, Isaiah was warning the people to repent before any of this come to pass. Multiple prophets warned northern Israel, and they didn't listen. And Assyria conquered them and exiled a remnant of survivors. Now, just like the northern tribes, Judah didn't listen when God sent prophets to warn them, and Judah didn't repent. And exactly what was being predicted to them was starting to happen. In Isaiah chapter 39, verses 6 and 7, says, "Behold, the days are coming when all that is in your house and all that your fathers have laid up in store to this day will be carried to Babylon. Nothing will be left, says the Lord. And some of your sons who will issue from you, whom you will beget, will be taken away, and they will become officials in the palace of the king of Babylon." Just a few years before it happened, the prophet Habakkuk was shocked when God said that he was going to send Babylon as an instrument of justice, as wicked as Babylon was. Just 2 years after Zephaniah prophesied, Babylon is at their door. Now we know that Jerusalem fell and was destroyed in 586 BC, but that siege occurred long before that. Babylon came into Israel within 3 sweeps, and they carried away prisoners and loot from the temple, and the loot from this temple will come back into the play in chapter 5, so kind of keep that on the back burner of your mind. The very first raid of the 3 occurred in 605 BC. This raid by Nebuchadnezzar was interrupted when he had heard of his father's death and raced back to Babylon to secure his spot on the throne. Speaking of Nebuchadnezzar's father, his name was Nabopolassar, which may confuse you if you have a study Bible or read a study guide that calls Nebuchadnezzar II. The second of his name doesn't refer to his father, but refers to the fact that he's the second king of the Babylonian dynasty. His father had founded it. So the first raid was cut short in 605. This is the raid in which Daniel is brought to Babylon, as we read here in the text today. The second one was in 597 BC, in which Ezekiel was brought to Babylon. Now after that, Jeremiah continued to warn Judah, but even after the first 2 raids, the people that remained behind had hardened their hearts. They thought that those who were captured must have been cursed by God, and that's why they were removed, and others remained fine along with the temple. Well, in 586, they had to shut their mouths as they saw their city and their temple as they were being led out of the city. They saw it all being burned behind them. And like the previous two waves of people that were exiled, they began the 900-mile journey to Babylon, which is modern-day Iraq, on foot. So it's safe to assume that they walked for several months before arriving. Let's continue on into verses 3 through 5. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, the chief of his officials, to bring in some of the sons of Israel, including some of the royal family and of the nobles, youths in whom was no defect, who were good-looking, showing intelligence in every branch of wisdom, endowed with understanding and discerning knowledge, and who had the ability for serving in the king's court. And he ordered him to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. The king appointed for them a daily ration of the king's choice food, and from the wine which he drank, and appointed that they should be educated 3 years, at the end of which they were to enter the king's personal service. Here is where we see different tactics taken by Babylon when compared to Assyria when they had conquered the north. When Assyria invaded Israel in 722, many people were killed. They're led out with fish hooks in their nose, and they're all tied together. The Assyrians were very, very cruel people. They literally skinned men alive and used their flesh on their furniture and as wall coverings in their home. So we're talking about some brutal, sick, and cruel people. But Babylon here is using a different tactic. Rather than torture and abuse the people that they've taken captive, they bring them into this beautiful and amazing city. They give them all the creature comforts. They give some of them a chance at a palace job. Instead of killing their enemies, Babylon tried to absorb them into their nation to make them Babylonians. We see here that they were to learn the language of Babylon, all the popular literature, all of their sciences. Basically, they tried to make you forget everything about your old life, your old home, and your old God. They would rather make you one of them than kill you. Now, the devil has deployed both of the tactics of the Assyrians and of the Babylonians against God's children throughout the ages. We see in history and currently on the news about violence against both Israel and Christians around the world. So that's the tactics of Assyria. But a popular trend, and one that our country has adopted, is that of Babylon, trying to absorb the people into their worldly culture. You can raise your children in a Christian home and have them in church their whole lives, and colleges are going to indoctrinate them with the polar opposite worldview. Friends, media, entertainment, and the lure of sin is going to be pulling at the hearts of people every day. And if the world cannot destroy believers, it will try to absorb them. In verse 3, the king was seeking new assistants and advisors from these exiles. It would benefit him to have people with insight to the Jewish people that are living in his domain, but he also wanted the best and brightest for other jobs that he had in mind. So he began with some of those from the royal line or from the lineage of David. But that wasn't enough by itself. They had to be the smartest, they had to be the best looking, and they had to be the wisest of all the people that were available. Then they're going to undergo training to forget all that they knew about home and learn about Babylon, which is to become their new home. Only the most faithful would realize that Babylon would never be their home. These 4 men in these next few verses will comply with the rules unless it caused them to violate God's law. This would present conflict more than once in their stay in this foreign country. So we too would do well to remember that this world is not our home. Sometimes we can get too attached or too invested in this modern Babylon that we live in today. The world keeps trying to absorb you. There's going to come a time when you're going to have to take a stand. But pick your battles. These men didn't bicker and be stubborn over every little thing, just the issues that were blatantly against God's will. They learned the literature and the sciences of the land, even though they knew most of it was false and it was baloney. Kind of like when I was taught about evolution and the Big Bang Theory in school. I learned it because it was required of me to learn it, but I didn't buy a word of it. I wasn't believing it, and I wasn't even a Christian back then. There is nothing wrong with obtaining knowledge if it's required of you. As long as you have the discernment to recognize that that is garbage and don't let it into your heart, that's fine. In Acts chapter 17, Paul did this. He quoted pagan Greek philosophers, and he used it as an icebreaker to share the gospel. The historian Josephus, he quoted Menander, another Greek philosopher. So let us go on and see this amazing count of these four faithful young men who knew when to put the brakes on this new culture transition. Let's read verses 6 and 7. Now among them from the sons of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Then the commander of the officials assigned new names to them. To Daniel he assigned the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah Shadrach, to Mishael Meshach, to Azariah Abednego. Okay, I want to stop for a minute there and try to put ourselves in the shoes of these young men. Now, for an example, I'm just going to use a random country here, so don't get your undies in a bunch if you happen to be from whatever country I pick. This is just an illustration. Suppose China or some other country conquered the United States and they flew you across the globe to their country. You now have 3 years to learn the Chinese language, to learn about that nation's history, which will likely be rewritten to make them look good, so it'll all be propaganda. You now have to learn all of their famous writers, their sciences, and you're going to have to learn the metric system. You now live in a country that does not believe the things that you used to believe. Nothing looks like home, and you're being forced to eat things that probably disgust you, and now they even take your name away. Now, to a young Jewish person, there was a lot of meaning to their name. So when we look at their new names issued to them by Babylon, let us look at what these names mean and why it must have broken their hearts to bear these names. Daniel, his name used to be God is my judge when it was in Hebrew, but when it was changed to Belteshazzar, it means Bel protects his life. Bel was one of the false gods of Babylon. Hananiah means the Lord shows grace. They changed his name to Shadrach, which is command of Aku, which is the moon god of Babylon. Mishael, his name meant who is like God. They changed his name to Meshach. It means who is as Aku is. And then Azariah, which means the Lord is my help, they changed his name to Abednego, which is servant of Nebo, or servant of Nego. Now, while I am certain that they're not big fans of these new names, we don't read of them protesting the name change. They knew that this was blasphemous on the part of the commander to take names that glorified God and change them into the names that glorify idols. But in the hearts of these young men, they knew who they still were. In private, they probably used their old names. They knew that this wasn't their choice and that God knows who they really are, and they are loyal to God and only to Him. Let's go on into verses 8 through 13. But Daniel made up his mind that he would not defile himself with the king's choice food or with the wine which he drank. So he sought permission from the commander of the officials that he might not defile himself. Now God granted Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the commander of the officials. And of the commander of the officials said to Daniel, I am afraid of my lord the king, who has appointed your food and your drink. For why should he see your faces looking more haggard than the youths who are your own age? Then you would make me forfeit my head to the king. But Daniel said to the overseer, whom the commander of the officials had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days, and let us be given some vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance be observed in your presence, and the appearance of the youths who are eating the king's choice food, and deal with your servants according to what you see. In verse 8, Daniel and his friends put the brakes on and they spoke up. They're willing to learn all of this new stuff. They're willing to even go by these crazy names that really just made their stomach turn, but they refused to eat this stuff that the king issued to them and to all the other young men. The reason they refused that is because eating this food was a direct violation of God's law. Now remember, this is the Old Testament. This was before these foods were later declared clean. As their food was brought to them, this was the same stuff that the king was getting, but these guys knew that it was not kosher, that it violated God's law. Maybe there was slabs of pork ribs or bacon sandwiches, shrimp, catfish, raspberries, jello, all of these foods that are considered unclean. But another reason is that most of the food and the wine that the king gave them had been purchased at the market that sells stuff that had been offered to idols. Again, today, that would not be a big deal these days because we know that idols are just lifeless trinkets to us. But to those of the old covenant, this was major. Now, verse 9 tells us that God granted favor for Daniel in the eyes of the commander. Had he not done that, severe repercussions may have followed. I mean, who is a prisoner to change the orders of a king and to refuse to eat something? That commander also feared for his own life, and he showed a great display of honesty to Daniel. He showed transparency. He goes, "You will make me forfeit my own head if you don't do this." So with the commander saying no, Daniel pleads his case with the overseer that the commander had appointed over to watch them. He told that guy, he goes, "Look, test us for 10 days on nothing but vegetables and water. If we look poor after 10 days, you can do with us as you wish." I mean, they've got 3 years. There's more than enough time to undo any damage that 10 days of vegetable would do. But Daniel knew that God would honor his decision for this. Now, I know that some vegans love this verse, but don't overlook the context of this. When they asked Ashpenaz to do this, he refused. He has done this job well for a while now, getting people prepped and getting them to look good, and he knows that a steady diet of nothing but vegetables and water will not produce healthy looking young men. Even the overseer knew that they would be poor and gaunt looking from eating nothing but this. Now I know that there are a few vegan bodybuilders out there that look impressive after tons and tons of hard work, but that is not the norm. Most that I see are not very big and their eyes are sunk in and you can see every bone in their body. I'm not shaming them at all. I know myself, I could stand to live on vegetables for a few years, so I have no room myself to body shame anyone. But plain and simple, it was well known to all of those in the palace that if those young fellows didn't take in any protein, they're not going to be filled out like nobles are supposed to look. So Daniel says, look, just give us a 10-day trial period. Cancel it any time after that. Like I said, after all, they got 3 years before they got to be presented to the king. What would 10 days hurt? And by the way, I wonder something here. According to the book of Jeremiah in chapter 52, Jeremiah tells us that 3,023 Jews were deported in the first wave, obviously just counting the men. In the second wave, Jeremiah says 832, and in the third it was 745, making 4,600 in all. However, it is likely that only the men were counted, as I said. So you're looking at 14 to 20,000 people being carried away into exile. Now we only have the names of 4 that refused to eat the king's meat and drink his wine. Now maybe there were more than that refused, just like Daniel and these 3, but we aren't told about them. But it makes you wonder how many people did cave in to peer pressure and were afraid to take a stand for God. Let's continue on into verses 14 through 16. So he listened to them in this matter and tested them for 10 days. At the end of 10 days, their appearance seemed better, and they were were fatter than the youths who had been eating the king's choice food. So the overseer continued to withhold their choice food and the wine they were to drink, and kept giving them vegetables. God again steps in here, as for 10 days the VeggieTales boys looked healthier than the guys who'd been sitting around eating these rare steaks and sipping Starbucks. So if he can make a normal-sized man super strong, like he did with Samson, and make a shepherd boy with a sling and a rock kill a Philistine giant, God can make even a vegetable lover prosper. Now, I'm kidding. Don't send me hateful emails. But you have to admit, even the guards had to have been surprised. This was the hand of God at work, because there is no biological reason why a vegetarian diet should make people appear fuller and better and fatter. I heard something interesting about verse 16 also this week. Some scholars are debating about something here that really isn't that important to us, but it makes you stop and think. When it said in that verse that the overseer took away their portion of the meat and the wine and gave them veggies and water, it could mean that they did that for Daniel and his 3 friends, or it could mean that it worked so well on these 4, they decided to do that for all the men that were in training. Can you imagine some poor guy sitting back getting his pork chop yanked out of his mouth, and they stick a carrot in there, and the guard's going to say, well, you can thank those guys over there for your change in diet. But the success of the diet was God's way in rewarding them for their faithfulness to his law, for not defiling themselves when it would have been so much easier for them just to cave in and to compromise. When we are dwelling in our Babylon-like society, we got to be careful not to get too comfortable and not to compromise our morals in the same way. God wants to reward you for your faithfulness, but you have to be faithful to get rewarded for being faithful. Besides letting them look healthier than the others, God blessed them in other ways that would serve them well in their palace positions. It would also serve God well too, as they're going to continue to glorify him in the midst of that pagan nation. Let's go ahead and get verses 17 through 21. As for these 4 youths, God gave them knowledge and intelligence in every branch of literature and wisdom. Daniel even understood all kinds of visions and dreams. Then at the end of the days which the king had specified for presenting them, the commander of the officials presented them before Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and out of them all not one was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's personal service. As for every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king consulted them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and conjurers who were in all his realm. And Daniel continued until the 1st year of Cyrus the king. Have you ever studied something with all your might, then you just get frustrated that you just can't grasp and can't understand what you're trying to learn? Maybe it's the instructions for putting together this new toy that your kids got for Christmas. For me, it's foreign languages. I've studied Spanish and Hebrew for years, but I struggle to gain any real proficiency. And some people just grasp it like it's nothing at all. These guys were blessed with the ability to remember, recall, and recite anything and everything that they had to read to learn Babylonian culture. Their knowledge surpassed all the others who are still just trying to grasp speaking the Babylonian language. But the knowledge of facts and theories is one thing. Most people can remember and recite useless facts and data. Unless you're on an episode of Jeopardy or you're having trivia night, it's not as useful as something like wisdom and discernment. That makes knowledge practical and useful if you have wisdom and discernment. But God gave Daniel that in great amounts as well. When the big day of meeting the king arrived, these guys, they're at the top of the class. I mean, they just outshined everybody. And all of the others looked like plump dummies by comparison. Now, I don't know what the testing consisted of on that big day, so all we can do is guess. I'm picturing in my mind that they had to recite some of the noted philosophers of the day, and maybe the history of Babylon, possibly some facts about the king, but they did so so in perfect Chaldean without even a hint of Israeli accent, or I'm assuming they did. Perhaps the king asked them questions and made them decide what action should be taken in certain scenarios, and they answered in ways that would leave Nebuchadnezzar and the others just speechless. All we know is that these guys rocked the test, whatever it was. They got the king's attention, they got the king's trust, and they solidified their position in the palace as advisors to the king. It truly was a win-win because God now had faithful servants of his in a very strategic place. That and the fact that his faithful children had just proved superior to all those in the land by glorifying God, and they did so by making the idols of Babylon look terrible. I think of Joseph when I read of the young man in Daniel. Joseph didn't choose his lot in life. He was sold into slavery. Joseph was later wrongfully accused and cast into prison, and he was always careful to do the right thing, even when everything bad had happened to him. But God used those things to elevate Joseph into a strategic position, which led to the preservation of God's people and Joseph's family during a severe famine. This wasn't the last time these young men are going to have to take a stand against the most powerful ruler in the land at that time. It's going to get more intense as we go further into Daniel. But not only would it be wise to follow their example of refusing to compromise our faith to the surrounding culture, we would also benefit from doing it the way that they did it, with the respectful attitude, and by picking our battles. They didn't expect a pagan culture to conform to a God that they didn't know, and neither did they allow themselves to be conformed. They were in Babylon, they were not of Babylon. They didn't stage a protest when their names got changed. They didn't start a petition. They didn't get violent. There was no rudeness, no shouting, no boycotting, and they let minor stuff slide that didn't really matter. But when the time came to take a stand, they did so with proper respect, with calmness, and through diplomacy, and having favor in their eyes, thanks to God. There's an old saying that says, "Speak softly and carry a big stick," but the Bible tells us a kind answer turns away wrath. In this world that's so divided over everything, stop straining gnats and learn to pick your own battles, and do so without belittling the other person. After all, Jesus didn't call us to win arguments and debates. He called us to win souls.